there is no solution to this other than sitting there accepting it's all failed. We're going to have to start again. And we're going to need some people who actually understand the gravity of the problem, understands it. We're going to have to find ways to make friends with arch enemies and worse, because in the end, we're going to be dependent on those resources for us to have any hope in the future of being able to dig ourselves out of this terminal decline into what I would literally call a third world economies, and being able to build, and I would think it'd be possible to build it relatively quickly, but still we're talking a decade where we can move through being an emerging economy and be a first world, economies again. But to do that, we're going to have to embrace the multipolar world. We're going to have to embrace win-win cooperation and realize unipolarity is dead. The dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, and we will no longer have a world reserve currency because we don't need it.
Wednesday, August 27th, 2025, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to a regular guest, Paul from the Sirius report. Welcome back, Paul. How are you doing?
Well, Mario, it's a pleasure as ever. It's great we catch up again. Yeah, everything's fine my end and good with you.
Yeah, very good. Everything's great, except of course for what's going on outside in the real world or in the world, so to speak. But as I always try to think, Paul, I can only do what I can do, the best that I can do. And it's very difficult to try to change what the powers that be and other people do. But be as it may, it's good to know what they're doing. And it's one of the reasons why I like to have you on. You do some great macro analysis. And I like to let the viewers know as well that Paul has had for a while, a YouTube channel, and I highly recommend it. It's the Sirius report, and you can learn about all the other services he provides through the YouTube channel. So, Paul, I wanted to start with actually, I'm going to refer back to Vladimir Lenin. Yeah, that old guy. He said once, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. They say, I mean, AI overview on Google says it's attributed to him. So even if it's not him, it's an interesting quote, and I think it makes sense. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because you've recently spoken about the fall of the West, and then it got me thinking about the fall of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Empire or Eastern Europe. And I remember that really well because I was an adult. I was in my early 20s. And it happened so quickly that it's a little bit of what Lenin supposedly said. Some things that take decades or maybe centuries sometimes happen in weeks. And if I look at the timeline here, yes, Poland kicked off the fall of the Iron Curtain, and that was June 1989. And then every month from June to the end of the year, all these countries, all the communist regimes in the Eastern European bloc collapsed. And by 1990, they were already having free elections. By 1991, the Warsaw Pact collapsed. So it was very quick. So my question to you is, this fall of the West that you have spoken about recently, do you think it's going to happen very quickly as well and will take a lot of people by surprise?
I think firstly, it will take a lot of people by surprise. It's rather like what happened in what was the Soviet Union. I mean, I did something on my own channel with a good friend of mine, Paul, and it's worth listening to because he experienced it through growing up in Latvia with the sort of fall of the Soviet Union, and he discussed it. So I'd get people to listen to that from that perspective. And as he pointed out, and we've discussed it many times, people were totally surprised. I mean, because effectively the statement that permanently came out of the Soviet Union or out of Russia was everything's fine, there's no problems, everything's robust, the economy's fine. Nobody was actually paying any attention in that regard to reality as everything was just slowly sinking into the abyss. And in many ways, it kind of reminds me of the same kind of philosophy and attitude we see in the West today with the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe. They're all talking as though everything's fine, there's no problems. Yeah, or oh well, this is just a little bit of a blip. We've got slight problems in the economy. Maybe there's a bit of inflation, and oh, we've got a bit of a black hole in our finances, but we'll sort it out, and just essentially pretending that everything's okay. But I mean, and recently I talked short, quite briefly, but to the point about what was going on in the UK. As an example, I don't think the UK is unique. Germany's only today come out and effectively admitted, oh, we can't pay for the welfare state anymore. That's as bigger indication of holding your hand up and going, we're bankrupt, it's game over, that you're ever likely to hear me, because Germany has a pretty extensive welfare state. But they've run it basically, it's an indication they're bankrupt. And if you look in the United Kingdom, we talk about first world economies and third world economies and the emerging markets. And really, Britain and all these European nations, including and the United States, their economies are going from what you would call a first world economy, and they're moving past being what you would call an emerging market into third world economic status. Now, a lot of people will go, that's absurd. I just can't believe that. But just look at what's happening with regards to the fact that we have, for example, in Britain, we have very low productivity, we have a very low tech economy, living standards are in decline. We're certainly seeing clear indication of ongoing political instability and social unrest. We have very poor public services, the infrastructure. To say it looks old is an understatement. We're constantly, since 2008, on and off having fiscal crises. I mean, all the institutions that govern the country just look like they're totally unfit for purpose. And, we also just have a complete lack of trust and rightly so, in the whole governance structure. This is more like a third world nations. And the question everyone should ask themselves is, well, what can we do to remedy this? Well, apart from having a political system that is an abysmal failure and needs to be sort of, you know, completely changed. And I'm not just talking about new political parties, just people who actually know how to run a country or are even capable or allowed to run a country. And that's an entirely different matter. But what do we do in the future to resurrect this problem? Or I'll resurrect the nation so we start moving back in the right direction. And it's very difficult to see because we all need across Europe cheap Russian energy, which nobody wants anymore, although secretly, of course, instead of having it through Nord Stream, which was blown up, of course, by the Americans, instead they get it all through LNG. I mean, which is absolutely ridiculous because that comes via China. So it's three, four, five times as expensive as the pipeline gas. Well, that's just an economic financial disaster, not even in the making. It's happening in reality now, and it causes inflationary problems because everything costs so much more to either produce or to heat and light homes, heat and light buildings, etc., etc. And also, of course, they need huge inward investment to be able to have high-tech economies again that might actually also be capable of, as I've always used the crude analogy, manufacturing a widget that is the same price as the Chinese. Otherwise, everyone will buy them still from China. That is a huge problem. So we need massive investment. Where's that coming from? From bankrupt nations in the West? No. So the argument is you need to seek huge investment from China. Well, that's going to be a huge problem in of itself because of this reluctance amongst Western countries. It's not quite the same relationship the West has with Russia, but it's still problematic. And really, without that huge investment, there is no way we can begin to arrest this sharp decline because otherwise, what do we do? I mean, where do we start in trying to perhaps need low value added manufacturing? We need resources. We don't have the resources. I mean, we need foreign companies willing to either partner with us. We don't want to do that. Maybe we need them to offer us technology transfer, and et cetera, et cetera. No one's thinking about this. We're just sat there going, well, everything's okay, like the Soviet Union did. It's not a problem. But we've been in serious decline in the West for decades. And it all started once we embraced financialization and said, well, the real economy doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter if we don't produce anything anymore. Now, I'll be the first to admit in the 80s, at that point in time, a lot of like coal mining was just economically unviable. No dispute on that. But the absolute criminal mistake the Thatcher era did was to go, we're just abandoning all that. Everyone can be thrown on the scrap heap. We're going for financialization because massive amounts of money will be made in that sector and it'll trickle down into the real economy and everyone will be happy. And it's never worked. It never will work. And now we're at the point where financialization is playing out to its natural conclusion, which is total destruction of economies and the financial system because we now have ludicrous asset bubbles where, just in very simple terms, any financial asset is priced massively higher than it should be. And at some point, all will have to return to the mean or the true mean. And that will make 2008 look like a drop in the ocean. So we have to contend with that also. So that is in really a very sort of 30,000 foot view of why we are in this serious decline. And, all the things I've mentioned in varying ways was exactly the problems the Soviet Union experienced. Now, I'm not making comparisons that we live in the Soviet Union, we don't, but there's some broad similarities in there.
Yeah, sorry, Paul. That's what I was just thinking. I know we're not supposedly communists and we can travel abroad and do stuff and still be fairly critical of government, even though that's here in the UK, that's not so clear. But it seems to me that we've become sclerotic, not just in the UK, but Western Europe, even in the US. There's so much rules and regulations. The welfare state is massive, and not just welfare state, but also corporate welfare state. We just saw President Trump invest in Intel and say that he wants to invest in a lot more companies. Why do companies need subsidies? So yeah, I'll let you continue though with your comparison with the Soviet Union.
Well, yeah, you make a great point. Intel's a classic example of, people have derided the Russians and the Chinese for having state-owned enterprises, which have actually been extremely successful. I'm talking about with Russia in the post-Soviet world, China absolutely successfully having state-owned enterprises. And now, rightly, we have the US government taking a stake in Intel, and who's next? And no one's asking the questions, why are they doing this? They're not, I mean, they're trying to sell it, well, this is a great investment for the government, not, well, what's the problem with Intel? Why would you have to do that? And really, it's just indicative of more domestic internal problems. And really, the basic bottom line is that even Western companies who historically have been pretty successful are now facing immense challenges from the global south from the Chinese and other countries who their cost matrix is so much cheaper. They're able to innovate far quicker, and they are rapidly emerging out of being what you would, I mean, to call China an emerging market's a bit of a farce now because, to all intents and purposes, it is the largest economy in the world. However, people want to look at it, given when you look at a measure of GDP, we include recycled debt, new debt issuance, government spending. I mean, I'm not saying other countries don't, but when you start to strip out the non-productive parts of our supposed economy, there's not an awful lot less. Whereas countries like China is demonstrating that it now is a very high-tech orientated nation who is leading the world in many technological spheres, and the West can't compete with them. And also because, of course, we've had this huge deterioration in our education system. Now, I'm not advocating everybody should do sciences or the STEM subject, which is science, technology, engineering, and maths. Yeah, I was a physicist, okay, so but I'm not advocating that that's the be and end all of life. It isn't. But we've neglected these areas for a very long time, and now we're paying the price. And it's quite interesting. I was talking to someone a few days ago who was telling me it appears that suddenly, in the last couple of years, there's this emergence of people suddenly being interested in STEM subjects. And I no doubt believe it's because they think they can earn lots of money in those sectors. Well, that doesn't matter. If that's the motivation, so be it. I mean, I'm not saying it's the correct motivation, but if it gets people wanting to engage again in these subjects, then it gives the West or the United Kingdom some glimmer of hope in the future. But this is all something that isn't going to be fixed today, tomorrow, next week, or even next year. This is a long term 5, 10, 15, 20-year generational problem that needs addressing. And this is why, in many senses, yeah, politically, we weren't the Soviet Union in any way, shape, or form, but we're behaving like the Soviet Union in terms of how everything is rapidly degrading, and we're just pretending that everything's fine, it's not a problem. But 2008 was the wake up call where everyone should have sat there and gone, this is game over. Financialization is dead. It's failed. I mean, if we hadn't had all this QE, zero interest rate policy intervention, the whole thing would have gone in totality. That was the indication. We did nothing. We just sat there and went, no, we'll have more financialization. We've got this great way of allowing financialization to continue because we're now going to just print money like there's no tomorrow. And we're going to have zero interest rate policy. And we can keep ZERP in place forever. And of course, that was until, ironically, we had the pandemic, and then suddenly their worst nightmare happened, where the all this inflation that they kept inside the financial system and in all these asset bubbles from 2008 going through to 2020 or 21, it all then seeped into the real world. And we've had inflationary problems since as a result of it. And it's impossible for us to remove that problem. And not least, what is making things even worse is having access to far more expensive energy. But also, as the United States is now finding out that tariffs are inflationary, they do create problems in the sense that everything costs more. And also, it's creating producer price inflation. So therefore, if you manufacture anything, produce anything, then it gets more expensive. So this is going to inevitably cause havoc in the future because for now, a lot of the retailers have been trying to absorb the extra costs, not as people thought would happen. China would just lower their prices. They went, we're not doing that. You haven't got an alternative market. Sorry, you have to suck up the extra 20, 30, 50, whatever percent. But we're now getting to the point that a lot of the retailers are going, we can't absorb these increases anymore because it's killing our bottom line. So the consumer is going to have to pay an awful lot more for this. So this is another example where it will create inflation, and because of the increase in prices, and therefore on that basis, it starts to play havoc with what does the Federal Reserve do, because they're under enormous pressure to cut interest rates. Well, if your economy, you're seeing more and more inflation, then actually cutting interest rates is a total disaster, because you're actually going to end up making inflation even worse and all the attendant problems that causes. So there is no solution to this other than sitting there accepting it's all failed. We're going to have to start again. And we're going to need some people who actually understand the gravity of the problem, understands it. We're going to have to find ways to make friends with arch enemies and worse, because in the end, we're going to be dependent on those resources for us to have any hope in the future of being able to dig ourselves out of this terminal decline into what I would literally call a third world economies, and being able to build. And I would think it'd be possible to build it relatively quickly, but still, we're talking a decade where we can move through being an emerging economy and be a first world, economies again. But to do that, we're going to have to embrace the multipolar world. We're going to have to embrace win-win cooperation and realize unipolarity is dead. The dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, and we will no longer have a world reserve currency because we don't need it. And this is a mindset shift and a behavioral shift that is going to be extremely difficult for people in the West to accept, and particularly those in at the political level, whoever you want to believe runs countries, and also how industry is going to deal with this, and all those who for so long have just rested on their laurels thinking, well, we're the first world economies. They talk about the world, which is just them. Well, now they're going to have to turn around and admit the world is a globe. It does include the global south countries, and who at the moment are the ones rapidly accelerating towards being first world economies. And the challenge is, after financialization, what can you do so our cost of living is actually comparable? How all the cost matrix gets slashed, how you and basically remove all the leverage in the financial system, all the margin, and how we are in a situation we can return to the mean without completely destroying everything. That seems almost impossible because of how big these asset bubbles now big this idiotic world of financialization has become. And what are the consequences for that completely blowing up? And no one's dares think about that. All they're thinking is, well, if it happens again like 2008, we'll just print some money, we'll bail some banks out. Well, the problem is, what they fail to understand is, since 2008, they've destroyed everything in the real world, which was always going to happen. And what I wrote to governments in when they announced QE and said to them, if you implement this for more than several months, you will end up destroying everything in totality. And more importantly, you destroy the real world in trying to protect your artificial world that only exists in your mind and in your greed to be able to profit at the expense of everybody else. And now they've run out of road, and the real economy is sinking, and there's no way to solve the problem, because their attitude is, well, if economies are sinking, if we're having a recession, I know, let's have austerity. Let's increase taxes. What, when everything's just in terminal decline? That will do absolutely nothing except accelerate the demise of everything. And there's no way to fix anything anymore other than actually having to take a dose of really horrible medicine, accept, like Russia had to, it was over, and then go about actually trying to do something to rebuild their economy, their society. And the other question is, with all due respect, the Russians have a lot stronger constitution to deal with that for a very long period of time. I don't see much evidence of many people, not everybody, in the West having the constitution to have to deal with the fallout of that because they just simply won't cope. They simply won't be prepared to roll up their sleeves and realize that when the going gets tough, the tough have to get going. There's no evidence to suggest they'll do that because they've spent large parts of their lives thinking everything was fine, not paying any attention to what was going on, and expecting the state to always be there to bail them out. Where if the going did get tough, well, in the future, that's just simply not going to be possible anymore.
You mentioned that after the '08 crisis, nothing was done to reform the system and basically get rid of financialization, get rid of over-the-counter derivatives, make things like more sane, a bit like Iceland did a couple of years later, albeit Iceland is a small country, but they put a lot of the bankers in jail. They reformed the system. But there were some people who actually warned. Actually, Hank Paulson, Paul, he in the movie The West is the movie. It's called The Last Days of Lehman in '09. He actually there's a scene there where he's with all the major Wall Street heads in a boardroom at the New York Fed, and he said the West is effed. He said we effed it up. And no, just not just you and me, all of us. So yeah, some people knew it, but politically, like you said, it's really difficult. And politicians, they never want the public to take the tough medicine because they won't get reelected. So, and also in The Big Short, Paul, I think it was Mark Baum at the end. His colleague was on the phone with him. Yeah, so now they're gonna jail all the bankers. They're gonna reform everything. They're gonna reorganize the banks. And then the guy said, "Oh, just kidding." So yeah, you're right. They haven't done anything. And yeah, we are paying for the '08, '09, well, to the response of the '08, '09 crisis, and also to the response of COVID, I would say. And that's why everything feels so topsy-turvy. And that's why I want to ask you about the meeting that President Trump had with President Putin in Alaska. And mainly because you mentioned that I guess what you're saying is, well, that unless the West embraces the multipolar world, we're going to be doomed for decades. And do you think that this meeting in Alaska was President Trump trying to take the first steps towards being more in the multipolar world? I think it might be, even though President Trump has done loads of stuff that make no sense. But I remember Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, he did an interview early on in the administration now with, I think it was Megyn Kelly. And he said, we're not in a unipolar world anymore, and we're going to have to deal with other countries equally. So just your view on that Alaska meeting and whether you think there's any chance that Trump could be moving to a multipolar world, even though at the same time we see that they've got a lot of their naval vessels surrounding Venezuela.
Yeah, it's one of those immensely complicated subjects because there is so much contradiction going on. But we shouldn't get bogged down too much in the contradiction because the United States is just a massive contradiction in the sense it will portray an attitude conveying one thing and then privately something very different. So just a small example of that is all the high octane rhetoric surrounding the Ukraine war for 3.5 years, despite the fact they spent practically every day on the phone to the Russians going, no, we weren't responsible for that. No, that's nothing to do with us. No, we don't want to escalate this. No, we're not sending these weapons because, of course, the Americans never wanted it to escalate into what would be in a direct war because that's World War III and it's just total annihilation of the United States, amongst other things. So that's saying one thing publicly and privately saying something very different. Now, with regards to Alaska, there are several angles to this. There's no doubt, and I made some YouTube clips about this, where this was the situation where the Russians gave the ultimatums. And really, the Americans walked out of the whole thing shell shocked. Even the US media admitted they were all shell shocked. And if you look at their sort of press conference, for want of a better word, at the end of Putin and Trump's meeting, it was Putin who spoke, which is highly irregular that the visiting president speaks first, but he spoke probably for 95% of the time. And Trump was very muted, very sort of quiet, not his usual sort of high octane, bombastic language of great deals and all this, just very subdued. And part of the reason is the Americans were told in no uncertain terms if you want the war to end, it's going to end on our terms, and it's the statements we've made for 3.5 years. Now, people can like it or not like it, it's irrelevant. We're not here discussing whether we agree with this or disagree with it. We're just saying the Russian standpoint's been very clear, and we don't need to go into all those points because that's not what we're here to discuss today. But they were also made very clear what has gone on in Ukraine for over a decade, what is going on today, because you can guarantee Trump and certainly a lot of his administration will have had no idea what's really going on. So that's kind of the first point with Ukraine. The second point is the United States has not been going all over the world talking about we're going to take Greenland. Okay, it subsequently died a death. What a surprise. And they're not talking about it anymore. But part of the reason is the United States is desperate for resources. Why does the United States want resources? Because it doesn't have them itself, even though lots of people would like to believe it has those resources. And it's the same with shale oil and gas. That is now in decline and could be in sharp decline very, very rapidly. So hence also why they signed this rather meaningless deal with Ukraine for minerals or strategic minerals, resources, etc. So the United States has been going all over the place and telegraphing the fact that it's got a serious problem, not least in energy terms. Now, of course, what is the one thing that would be hugely beneficial for the United States if it was possible to do so? To have rapprochement with Russia because Russia has vast amounts of oil and gas, at least another 200 years, which could actually heat and light the world for alone for that period of time. So the United States is going, well, we'd like to be part of your developments in the Arctic or the Russian Far East. That's a big, huge carrot to dangle in front of the United States, and they obviously desperately want to be part of that. But in order to do that, you have to satisfy all these other criteria, and you have to have rapprochement that means something, and you have to build trust, and you have to end the war on our terms, and that's how it's going to be. But the United States desperately wants that rapprochement. It desperately wants to build that relationship so they can get access to that sort of energy of which there's vast amounts untapped in the Arctic and also the Russian Far East. And of course, the Americans also have to realize, well, it's not just going to be you there, you're going to have the Indians there and the Chinese and everyone else. So it's not a monopoly and it's going to be on our terms. So that's another example where the United States desperately needs that. And it's not something that's publicly understood very well. Another point regards to this is future security of Eurasia in general, what that means for the future, including what happens with NATO. And the Russians made their position very clear that, as far as they're concerned, NATO as it exists now cannot exist that way in the future, and indivisible security is extremely important component that you're going to have to understand that our security guarantees are as important as Ukraine, and we regard Ukraine's security as vitally important too. This is not, one-way street as far as we're concerned either. So that's the nuts and bolts of really just saying to the Americans, look, the world as existed no longer exists. Unipolarity is dead. Multipolarity is the future, and you're going to have to address all these points we're making. Yeah, you can be a viable partner with us in Russia. You can start to integrate into the multipolar world as a result of that. But we're going to have all these concessions and change the whole landscape of the security of Eurasia in the future, which of course includes Europe vis-a-vis NATO itself. And in order to do that, you have to make some huge changes. And yes, they can go away with food for thought and be shell shocked and really surprised at the outcome of the meeting. But Americans being Americans, 5 minutes later, they're going, well, if we don't get a resolution, we're going to put more sanctions on Russia. And Russia's already said to them, sanction us as much as you like. We're fine. We're happy with it. In fact, sanctioning Russia benefits Russia because it makes industry work even harder to flourish domestically. I mean, for many years, Russian companies were lazy in not putting processes in place to have import substitution, develop their own domestic markets, develop markets with other countries in the world, in the global south, as opposed to the relationships they had with the West, with Europe, the United Kingdom, the US. So fine, do what you like. But in the end, the United States is going to have to embrace multipolarity. It's going to have to understand that the world's changing. Hence why they sat there trying to indirectly get Russia to the table and to put concessions in place Russia wasn't prepared to make with regards to Ukraine. They did it indirectly by saying to the Indians, well, we're going to put massive tariffs on your imports. And India went, fine, do it. We don't care. We're still going to buy Russian oil, and they're buying more Russian oil now than they've ever done since the war started. And as for threatening China, China just very impolitely just told them to get lost. And you don't tell us what to do. We're a sovereign nation. And what are you going to do? Sanction us? Don't be ridiculous. Go away and grow up. Quite literally. And that's how much the world's changing. And the US needs to embrace the future. And what I've always said, I know people say I'm very savage in criticizing the West and the US. Well, yes, because they've appallingly failed us as the people. And so therefore, we have every right to
Yeah.
criticize them. But
Yeah,
if they
some
want to
people,
change,
oh,
sorry, go on.
Paul. Yeah, I've heard someone comment that me, for example, that I'm very anti-Western and pro-BRICS, but I'm not. I'm just trying to warn. I've been warning about the petrodollar since 2017 that Russia and China are moving away from it. We're just trying to warn people of what's happening and how the world's reacting to it, how it's already impacting our economies. But yeah, sorry to interrupt you there if you want to
Oh,
continue.
no, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
So, in the end, the United States needs to be what I've always termed a great nation amongst equals. And if it wants to do that, it can flourish. And the global south can help rebuild America. But America is not going to be able to do what it thinks it's going to do, which is magically reindustrialize and be competitive with the rest of the world and be able to manufacture a widget a lot cheaper than they can in China. And I mean, the internal market is going to be a lot more expensive. This is inevitable as things stand. It's also not going to, as some people seem to think, simultaneously devalue the dollar and produce a manufacturing base that's successful in the same breath and then start exporting everything to the world. The moment it's a huge import market, that's never going to change for another decade. Maybe it might never change, of course. And on that basis, if you start hugely devaluing the dollar, well, what's it going to do to the cost of your imports? So, people have got ideas, and I applaud people's having ideas, but they're thinking you can magically solve 50 problems simultaneously, and you can't. And if the United States is serious about wanting to reindustrialize, then it's going to have to find a way, not through tariffs, which is just ultimately farcical. It's deeply damaging to the US economy. And ultimately, it'll be deeply damaging to the US financial system in the process because it will create inflation. I know people like to define inflation in a certain way, but my philosophy is if something costs 3 times more to produce tomorrow than it did yesterday, then that is going to create price inflation. Now, you can interpret price inflation however you like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those persons, but I agree with you. Prices will rise. And yeah, what you're talking about is price rises in lieu of monetary or currency inflation. But there was a banker, Felix Sommery, who said that inflation can only be caused by governments alone. So, in a way, I guess a tariff is a creation of the government. It's not the market that's doing that.
No, that's very true. And, in the end, everybody's finally beginning to realize that consumers will pay the price in the end. And therefore, everything will get far more expensive in the process. And there's no way around this problem until the US walks away from tariffs. And part of the reason they had to back down with China is because China went toe for toe and went, fine, because
Yeah,
here's the deal. We're not paying for the import duties effectively you're putting on our goods into the
yeah,
United States.
yeah,
So we don't care. But you know what we're going to do? We're going to whack tariffs up on your goods. And then the Americans panicked because they realized it would be pointless to export anything to China in the process. So that's why they backed off and went, oh, well, we'll have a think about this. Or we'll have a 90-day pause, or we'll have another 90-day pause. And because they've now realized that this is suicidal to do it, and increasingly, of course, with other nations, they'll come to realize that too. But politics being politics, it's very hard to walk away from what is your signature policy decision, despite the fact of the enormous damage it's going to cause to the United States internally. But these are the many, many challenges that exist for countries in the West, and they're not going to resolve them by thinking we can just keep doing what we have been doing. And you did make a great point where the pandemic caused immense damage. And I said at the start, when it was obvious they'd have to bail everything out because if they didn't, everything would collapse again. So they printed trillions of dollars or trillions of euros or pounds or whatever it was, that this would be a fatal mistake. And really, it would lead to really accelerating what was anyway going to be a terminal problem even more because then they started to put inflation in Main Street rather than in the financial sector, and we've never recovered from all the problems that the pandemic caused, and it really just highlighted the fragility of the real world. And we're not just talking about supply chains, etc., just how many businesses had a hand to mouth existence. And as soon as you upset that balance very slightly, so many businesses just went to the wall because it was impossible for them to operate and function as a meaningful going concern. And that problem's never gone away either. I know people like to think inflation's disappeared, but inflation doesn't disappear. Goods and services haven't gone back to their 2020 prices. They just continue to rise. And if we say, well, this month they only rose 2.5% instead of 3%, well, it's still 2.5%. And it's 2.5% more than the month before. But go back to 2020, how much have prices increased? And, you know, I we moved here in 3 years ago, and I've kept a receipt from when we first came for buying stuff in the supermarket, and I compared them. And my goodness, have the prices increased? And prices keep increasing with regards to food. So inflation hasn't disappeared whatsoever. And it's rather like all government metrics, they're complete fake and false. They actually massively underreport unemployment, they massively underreport inflation. And as for jobs data, well, just look at the United States. I mean, every month gets revised massively, whether it's revising down the number of jobs or revising up the number of people unemployed, and real unemployment rate in the US is probably 16%. And I would argue it's probably as high in the United Kingdom and across parts of Europe. And increasingly, of course, unemployment's rising rapidly because with financialization, everything has to be massaged to make it look like all balance sheets are perfectly healthy, when of course in reality they're not. And that's another reason why we know how much fudging goes on, because if you look how many years we had zero interest rate policy and then we raised interest rates, just alone all the interest rate swap market should have blown up, because you can't raise interest rates that much and that not to happen. And what should have happened is all the banks that had anything tied to interest rates on their balance sheet should have made them then insolvent. But for some weird reason, it didn't happen that much. I mean, yes, we had our medium tier banks in the US going to the wall. By and large, everything survived, and that is impossible given the nature of all the instruments related to interest rate, not least interest rate swaps, which all these financial institutions, or most of the major ones, should have been underwater so much that they were insolvent, basically. And then the
So,
argument, therefore, is they still are insolvent.
yeah, so how do you think you think the central banks are intervening through via the back door?
Well, I mean, yeah, but it can also not. We're back to this thing, and this is good. There'll be a few interesting remarks about this, but the truth is, in the United States, the the US Treasury controls the Federal Reserve. It's the US Treasury that makes a lot of makes the decisions, and the Federal Reserve generally obviously has to do as it's told. The interesting thing is currently we have this dynamic in the United States where the Federal Reserve isn't playing ball, which is why there's this big, I wouldn't call it a war necessarily, but there's a feud going on between Powell and the Trump administration, because the US Treasury isn't getting what they want, which is they want interest rates slashed. And the Federal Reserve and Powell's going, we're not doing it. And, I think the argument on balance is they're right not to slash interest rate. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious as to ascertaining precisely how you can massage a balance sheet so it doesn't look as though you're basically insolvent, because you can either have unrealized losses, or maybe they are realized losses, probably unrealized, but they're so enormous over what's occurred in the last, since 2020 when they started raising interest rates after that. You'd arguably say they must have be enormously underwater. And the argument is, how much underwater are they allowed to be as a result of this? So, and that is a whole separate subject, but I think to apportion it that it's just down to the Federal Reserve. It isn't. The US Treasury is as complicit in anything and all the things that have gone on with the United States and beyond for since really the inception of the ESF in 1934. That's when things changed massively. And it is why ultimately all the gold that was confiscated, in inverted commas, where did it all end up? It ended up in the US Treasury, and at the newly created ESF didn't stay at the Fed anymore. That's the big hint that a massive change happened there.
Yeah, Paul, you're talking about the unrealized losses and held to maturity securities. So that's what Paul means. Look at the losses now are huge, and this is not updated, but I'm sure it's still massively underwater. And this is what trigger the those bank failures, SVB, in the beginning of 2023, because some depositors there, like very wealthy depositors, thought, wow, they've got all these losses held to maturity. What if it makes a difference? So they started withdrawing millions of dollars from these banks and they collapsed. And then Janet Yellen, if you remember, she actually didn't bail the banks out, but she bailed out depositors with more than 250,000. And maybe that's why, like you say, Paul, the banks are continuing to function despite the fact that they're totally insolvent because maybe they expect the Treasury and the Fed to come in to the rescue. So it's almost like a weekend at Bernie's. You're just carrying a dead person, pretending it's alive. I wanted to ask you, as we move towards the end of our interview, more about the what you think will be like the trigger for the avalanche, so to speak, or the trigger for the collapse of the West. Do you see, as I do and many others do, that the bond market and bond yields rising could be the trigger? And if so, yeah, when do you think it could happen? I know it's a difficult question. And the other final question is, so it's a two-part question, and this is a controversial one because President Trump has been highly critical of BRICS. He says BRICS are anti-American, anti the dollar, but I actually think the BRICS, they want to deal with everyone. They just want to have more of an equal footing. So my question is, do you eventually see, and this would be one for the books, the U.S. joining BRICS?
Wow. That's a great question. Okay, the first one, what could cause a collapse and when could it happen? Well, I totally agree. There are many factors to this, but the bond market, absolutely. And we can see what's happening, ironically. Whatever people's perspective is on trust, the yields are higher now. So my argument is, why isn't the Bank of England intervening again? Why did it have to intervene during her very brief administration, but not at this point in time? There's a lot of unanswered questions, but it's not uniquely the United Kingdom, although the UK's yields are far higher and it's far more problematic. But the United States first faces the same problem, and European countries are facing the same problem. And of course, one of the big problems with the Western financial system since 2008 is they basically lassoed everything together. So if the United Kingdom's in major trouble, it's going to take the United States and Europe with it, and vice versa. If it's Europe, it'll take the United Kingdom and the United States with it. And obviously the same with the US. So yes, I think the bond markets is an enormous problem that's not going away. And we should also factor in what's going on with Japan in that regard. Also, what we also shouldn't lose sight of with regards to the general issues with the financial system is, I think subprime never went away. In fact, I think subprime's worse now than it's ever been. So could we have another subprime crisis? I think so. There is certainly very clear indications in pockets of the West, should I say, that we've got serious problems in the housing market. We've got serious problems in commercial real estate. That's big enough, I think, to blow things up as well in the process. I mean, vis-a-vis not entirely what caused 2008, but it's a significant reason. I also think there are enormous problems in the private equity sector, which is not regulated properly. There's a lot of things going on in there no one has any visibility of. I think that's an enormous problem in the making. Also, just the amount of leverage that exists. I mean, when we've got situations where we have sectors with leverage of 100 to 1 and this kind of nonsense, this is not sustainable either. And the risk of huge margin calls becoming a huge problem in any facet of the financial system is another huge problem in the making. And just generally, one can argue that the real world is cratering rather rapidly. And that alone can actually accelerate a huge financial crisis because the one thing the pandemic showed to us rather clearly is they sat there and went, well, if we don't do something, everything's going to go. The real world will just completely melt down in totality. So let's bail everyone out. I remember being there with my own business and I got phone calls literally every other day going, just claim the money. I said, I don't need the money. No, just claim it anyway, because you might need it in the future. And I go, I don't need the
Yeah,
money.
I remember it was 50,000 pounds, right?
Yeah, it was ridiculous. And yeah, and just, constantly just take. So they were terrified that everyone was going to go to the wall, every business, everybody would be destitute. Just take the money, bail everyone out. Now, their instinct is going to be when suddenly a massive problem happens again, they're going to go, we just need to bail everything out. But the argument is this time it's going to be infinitely worse than what happened during the pandemic. So, so what happens if you start printing trillions, tens of trillions, of euros, pounds, dollars? It's not just what it does to the currency, but what does it do to the broader financial system? I mean, also, there is a huge lack of confidence now in the US dollar, US Treasury complex. I mean, we've even got cases where the Europeans or even US institutions are going to Europe getting euro denominated debt as opposed to US dollar denominated debt. That's another enormous problem that's in the making. And we're, increasingly seeing countries in the global south saying, well, we don't want to settle this debt in dollars anymore with the Chinese. Can we settle it in the yuan? And they found a way around doing that as well. So that is a huge problem. And therefore, if you start having to print trillions of dollars, they think to stop everything collapsing, that is going to also, I think, precipitate a complete crisis of confidence in currencies. So what that therefore can have enormous implications also. Now that might seem a bit extreme, but what are they going to do? Like just ignore it and pretend it isn't a problem? Of course they can't do that. So anything really that is related to financialization, yeah, bond markets and all the things I've mentioned are obvious things, but anything that, what the derivatives markets and everything that encompasses is being some horribly stinky problem that has never gone away. It's also arguably questionable as to how that hasn't completely eviscerated financial systems in the process over the years, given everything that's happened. So that's something else to contend with. But it's just basically all the leverage, all the margin, all the enormous risk taking that has never gone away. And I maintain private equity is the silent killer as well in all this. So they're just some examples of problems, but if you want to drill it down to the minutiae, there's dozens and dozens of them. When does it happen? Well, we're always kind of, for me, in that window, and we have been for a considerable period of time. Could it happen in the autumn? Maybe. Is it going to happen? I wouldn't necessarily say so. But I think a lot depends on with the bond markets is at what point does it become such a huge problem that they have to massively intervene to deal with it? Because they are going to intervene, but what are the consequences of what they then do to intervene? And it's are we going to have problems in the repo markets in an enormous way? Yes, or I mean, reverse repos effectively at zero now.
Yeah,
So
Paul, I wanted to ask you about the reverse repo because the way I see it, and I'm not a specialist in repo or reverse repo, but reverse repo is when the banks have a lot of cash And instead of lending it to the private sector, they lend it to the Fed. So the fact that reverse repos now are almost at zero means that the banks have confidence in the private sector, so they don't need to, they're not lending to the Fed. So I guess if we start seeing reverse repo amounts start mushrooming or increasing, is that why it's an important signal? It would
It,
be a signal of trouble.
it can be, but also one may argue, and I'm not saying this is definitively the case, that in fact the reason reverse repos effectively gone to zero. I think it was about 28 billion the last time, or maybe 50 billion. Anyway, it fluctuates from day to day. Could in fact be a signal that it's not even that these financial institutions have confidence in other institutions. They just simply don't have these enormous capital buffers to do what they did previously, which
I
could
see. I
therefore
see.
imply something's going on inside the financial system. Now, as I say, I'm not saying that's the case, but it's a possibility. It doesn't necessarily mean they're parking the money elsewhere. Uh, it could be the case, and you're absolutely right. If it suddenly sharply increases, then that would kind of indicate also stresses existing. But I think the question is, when do we get another repo crisis? Is that something we might see? And it is possible we could see something like that even this year. I'm not saying definitely we will do, but I think it's entirely possible that that could be the case. I do think there's enough stresses and strains in the financial system and has been. And, I'd have to go back and think about this because I've doing my own podcast where I see odd things in the course of a year and go, that suggests potentially an issue or that's potentially a problem. But I genuinely think interbank lending hangs by a thread and has done for a very long time. And it wouldn't take much to cause another repo crisis, and it could happen
Yeah,
very rapidly and very suddenly. And that, therefore, then they'd have to intervene on that basis. And really, it's more, I think, for me, not about when these events happen, and because they're going to have to intervene, and they'll have to intervene in a way that you would defy belief, but they'll have no choice because the alternative is just to let it all collapse. But in intervening and in such an extreme way, then and they've got no choice as far as they're concerned, then it's the consequences of what doing that and what that's going to mean. Because if, for argument's sake, you came out and printed 10 trillion, 20 trillion, 30 trillion, to what does that mean? I mean, what is that going to do to bond yields, for example? I mean, and if as a result of all this, and we keep seeing, oh, Doge, we're going to cut government spending. Government spending is never going to be cut in the United States. It will just increase. Well, government spending is going to increase more and more and more. I mean, and therefore the question is, what happens to yields on bonds? Do they keep just increasing? And really, in reality, they should be a lot higher in the West than they are. What are the consequences then if you start printing enormous amounts of money? No one wants to buy US debt anyway. I mean, in the end, who is going to? I mean, banks are forced to when there's no foreign buyers. That's unfortunately part of the price they pay for being subservient banks to the US Treasury. Again, we're back to who controls who. They have no choice when there isn't foreign buyers, and they're having to do it currently. I think they're reluctantly doing it. But then there comes a point where if it's so enormous and the amount of debt that has to be issued, because they blow up the real world, and therefore, government spending, whether they want to or not, will massively increase more because we're back to the pandemic. What do they do? Allow everybody to become destitute, everybody to become homeless, everybody to not even have a shirt on their back. They can't feed themselves or anything. They're going to allow the entire US population or huge swathes of it to be subject to that. They won't do that. They won't entertain that idea because then 100 million very angry Americans is not a good recipe for stability in the nation as a whole. So they will have to make massive interventions, and the massive intervention in of itself, I think, would then pose massive problems for the financial system. I'm not saying that a crisis happens and it's not going to have massive implications in of itself. Of course, it will do, but in the process, in their response and what they do, they think to stop it completely causing meltdown will eventually cause a meltdown far worse because at the end of the day, the reason we are where we are now is because in 2008, they didn't make the right decisions. If they'd actually ironically made the right decision, we wouldn't be sat here now talking about things the way we are. I very much doubt gold would be at the 3,500 or roughly what it is in dollar terms now, etc., etc. This is all a consequence of just idiotic
Yeah,
financialization on
they took,
steroids. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, they took the wrong turning in '08, and it's really hard to get out of that road. And I think we're, speeding towards the precipice, unfortunately. And you just mentioned gold, and I was thinking about gold because of everything that you mentioned. It seems to me, Paul, that nothing's changed, and that the only true safe financial safe haven when this crisis comes is going to be physical gold and physical silver and maybe just hard assets outside the system. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I've, always made that point. I don't get into price predictions or, we're not here giving people financial advice. That's just my personal perspective. Mario shares that viewpoint, and I'm in total agreement with him. It is logically the only course of action. And I know people feel we've had enormous amounts of false dawns, and I can appreciate that. But just ask yourself why gold is at record. Oh well, okay, it's not quite at a record high now in dollar terms, or not far off in euro or the pound or the yen or anything else for that matter. There's a reason for that, and it's ironic that it is what it is, and they're still sat there going, "But everything's fine. You don't need to worry about anything. The economy is doing incredibly well, and there isn't anything to be concerned about." Well, that just demonstrates that alone why that is a nonsensical statement to make. And therefore, you have to do what you can and be prepared in any way you can. But that's a personal choice. There's plenty of people out there who think, Bitcoin's the future. Well, okay, if you think that, that's your choice. I think everybody knows my perspective on that. But that's a personal opinion, and if you want to think differently, that I don't have a problem with that. But I think at the end of the day, history will prove that hard assets and yes, there might be other resources that people could invest in potentially if they think that's the case. But as ever, we're not here to tell you what to do. Make your own decisions and go and talk to people who you think can give you the level of advice you require. But it's inevitable that everything associated with financialization, which is enormous, is not going to survive. It's impossible because at the end of the day, you can't just keep creating bigger and bigger bubbles and thinking there are no consequences for doing so. Yeah, eventually everything has to return to the true mean. And if you look at what happened in 2008 and when we had that correction, that return to the true mean was a drop in the ocean compared to what a drop now to the true mean would mean. It's so off scale compared to what it was in '08. And look at what happened in '08 alone. So you can't expect it to be less of a problem this time around. It's going to be significantly more. And also because now it's an everything problem. There is nothing in the West that isn't a problem, whether it's the currency, whether it's the financial system, whether it's commercial real estate, whether it's retail real estate, whether it's the real economy, etc. So everything is in serious decline. And all of those things are going to varying degrees impact the financial system and what happens to the broader economy in the future, and therefore underpins everything we've discussed. And that is a statement of fact. There's no way anyone can refute that. So, and when you don't have a currency crisis in the making or ongoing as in 2008, and we have that as well. It's very hard to pinpoint fixing in inverted commas, even though it isn't, and saying, well, we need to do this to repair this problem. If you have 20 problems simultaneously that all have interdependencies and they don't all require the same solution, and what you think you can temporarily fix one thing will blow something else up in the process. Good luck finding a way of digging yourself out that massive hole. And that's the problem the West faces as well, is sitting there and understanding that it isn't just a one uh, issue problem. It's multifaceted, and not one solution will fix all those problems on a temporary basis, or just repair to stop the dam breaking in totality. Never mind the long term or medium short term consequences of why that fixes nothing.
Paul, that was great speaking with you. We should do it more often. And if you want as well, I can come on your channel anytime.
Yes, that'd be great. Yes, we
Yeah,
we should do.
yeah,
Yeah, it's always, I find when we do things, it kind of stimulates interest when and you think about things,
yeah,
and at the end of the day, it's like what you're doing, Mary. You're trying to get people to better understand the reality of what is going on.
yeah,
And that's the name of the game. But at the end of the day, despite all the things that are going on, just try and be
yeah,
calm, try and enjoy your life as much as
yeah.
possible.
I
Don't
agree. And
be totally consumed by it all, because that's not healthy either.
no, and the thing is, the stuff we've talked about here uh, seems very serious and concerning, but it's not like the end of the world in itself. It's the end of the financial system, and that, even though is a huge task to rebuild it, it's not the end of the world. And like you said, you need to enjoy life, and just look at the old. Soviet bloc that collapsed in the late 80s, early 90s. But now they're in much better shape, I think, than we are.
Yes, ironically, yes.
It's not the end of the world. Yeah, and don't be. I think yeah, you're right. Enjoy life. Go out and smell the flowers, so to speak. And Paula, so with that, I'm gonna wish you a great day, and thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, an absolute pleasure, and likewise to yourself. And yeah, we look forward to doing more in the future.
Okay, thanks.